Okay, so I noticed I closed a lot of applications down because I noticed my camera freezes sometimes, and I just felt like it was using up too much RAM. So I closed a bunch of applications, but we're off to a bit of a choppy start. Even just with the interface, I noticed it was kind of chunky and um, kind of whatever. So hopefully this works out. So uh, right. So more antinatalism, if you haven't had enough quite yet. Uh, so yeah, I mean the issue of I've mentioned this before, but I think the issue of volition comes into play when it comes to the to and fro of life. We humans like to come up with meaning. We like to come up with if things have like a fatalistic outlook, then we feel like there is more meaning, that there is more value to our lives. And when things seem kind of random and without explanation, we get frightened, we get concerned, and we feel like things aren't working, like how could life be, and I'm using this word very lightly, how could things be random, right? And determinism is one of those free will kind of buzzwords and I don't want to say buzzword. I mean, I hate to diminish its weight, but I mean, in the argument of free will, determinism is a big is a heavy word. It's kind of pivotal and central to what arguments against free will state, and but it does not scratch that itch for meaning and for direction and for order. And when it comes to antinatalism, we find that the suffering that we experience, whether or not we play that down or up or whatever, which I also think we tend to play that down, the amount of suffering we have just out of an evolutionary and evolutionary slash psychological instinct and mechanism to deal with suffering. We want to feel that that suffering means that something is happening, that something is going to happen, and therefore the suffering is merited. But there was a caller on the last interview I listened to with David Benatar in South Africa, and you know she came up with this beautiful theory of God. Um, she said that, or it might have been a guy, I forget, but she said that, well, you see, the thing is, um, God had intended suffering to happen so that we may understand life in its full scope, in its full breadth. Um, and I find that hard to swallow. And I think David Benatar may have gone a little bit into it, although I think he just mainly touched on the point of without existence, there is no need to experience suffering or pleasure. It just doesn't, without existence, all of it's negated. Like there's no reason to understand that. But I mean, the caller that basically said this kind of missed like a kind of glaring point. And I mean, to borrow from atheism's rhetoric, I mean, what about the starving children in Africa, right? Like, I mean, wouldn't everybody be more better off if we all experience the full scope of suffering that's imaginable? What about the Holocaust and Auschwitz? What about Rwanda, and what about the Yazidi genocide? Like, I mean, these sex slaves that ISIS took. Like, I mean, if God had meant for us to experience these pains as a full experience of human life, then why don't we all experience them? Like, why don't we like? Shouldn't we put ourselves in harm's way? Like, shouldn't we help God along and put ourselves in harm's way to experience the full scope? Um, so I find it a bit silly. Now, volition, when it comes to antinatalism, as I mentioned at the start of the video, was I was trying to kind of ease my way into talking about the volition of God. Um, but I think, getting away from basically the pain and pleasure thing, we have to think of God as something that is, you cannot unprovable at this point. Like in the antinatalist argument, and David Benatar has said this before as well. You can't just assume God, and then because you could get into the whole atheist argument, all not the argument, but you could get it in atheistic arguments all over again and ask about which God and why and like what is the nature of God? Like I mean, all this stuff. I mean, as an example, like I mean, who's to say that God is all powerful? Like who's to say that God can stop or instigate suffering? Like who's to say that is something within God's purview? Um, so when people go on about God's will when it comes to pain and suffering and pleasure and the good things in life, you can't just assume God in the antinatalist argument. It doesn't like it doesn't jive because you just have a lot of you have like a huge burden of proof that just quite frankly can't be validated through any means. Like I mean, even religious people that aren't even all that scholarly say that God is outside provable provable context or realm. Like, I mean, so what you're kind of left with, like using the God argument is just is kind of void. Like it's not, it doesn't say much. Um, like, I mean, technically you could make up things about God just being the one that has bestowed antinatalist thought upon the human race. And it's, Jesus wasn't popular when he first came out, right? Um, or he was, but not amongst the right people, his own people actually, um, or at least the people who held sway. Anyway, so that's my video. I just want to end it there. Bye.